Alrighty, so welcome to another episode of History Bites. My name is Julia Ashworth, and I'm serving as the moderator for our February program. This month, we're featuring Katie Crooks from the Workhouse Arts Center, who will be leading this discussion on the rights of the incarcerated. Katie joined the Workhouse Arts Foundation in October of 2022 as the Director of Museum and Visitor Experience. In this role, Katie leads both the visual arts and visitor experience teams, ensuring the Workhouse Arts Center provides a welcoming and engaging environment where visitors can connect with art, history, and creativity. With nearly 20 years of experience in her museum field, both in the US and abroad, Katie brings a global perspective and a deep expertise to her role. Her passion lies in connecting people to art and history, finding ways to align visitors' interests with the workhouse's offerings to create a meaningful and memorable experience. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, Katie.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
All righty. So why don't you tell me a little bit more about what the Workhouse Art Center is and what your role is there?
I would love to. To kind of help us center a little bit, I'm going to share my screen with you all so I can show you a few images. That way you can kind of get a better idea for folks maybe who've never been to the workhouse site, which I'll forgive you if you haven't, but I hope that you all make it a point to come on out. So I'll start with just an artistic rendering of the campus, which I think makes it look really beautiful. The Workhouse Arts Center is a vibrant, creative community inhabiting the historic buildings of the former Occoquan Workhouse, part of a 3,500-acre correctional complex, the Lorton Correctional Complex, which closed in 2001. After which Fairfax County initiated a massive land reuse project, and our 55-acre site became the heart of that transformation. Our history is basically a tale of two eras. We began in 1910 under the Roosevelt administration's progressive ideals designed to rehabilitate low-level offenders through clean country air and vocational training. And for decades, it was a self-sustaining facility. However, by the 1960s, the majority of the farming endeavors and the prison industries had closed, and the site transitioned into a much darker, more dangerous period that lasted until the closure. But today, we have reclaimed that space. We are now home to a dedicated arts community of more than 70 working artists. We have a performing arts theater, a robust arts education roster with hundreds of classes a year, multiple galleries that feature local, regional, national, and even international artists. And we have our on-site history museum, the Lorton Prison Museum, featuring the Lucy Burns Gallery, which ensures that we never forget the complex legacy that preceded us. My role as the Director of Museum and Visitor Experience gives me the privilege of overseeing the three core pillars of our campus: visual arts, visitor services, and the preservation of our history. My work is dedicated to ensuring these three areas speak to one another and our other program areas to create a cohesive experience for our community.
Really wonderful. I mean, this truly sounds like such a fascinating place. Now, the workhouse's mission to combine art with this very difficult history of incarcerating is really, truly a fascinating one. Can you tell me a little bit more about how this came about and how it works?
Absolutely. The idea for the workhouse actually grew out, I would say, of the site's DNA. When community members pushed to save these historic buildings that were within, they weren't just looking at empty structures, they were looking at a site where architecture itself held artistic value. Every building was handmade by the people who were incarcerated here. And also, importantly, we realized that art was never truly absent here, even during the prison's operation. It was natural, if unexpected, and very much part of the landscape. Beyond simple graffiti, incarcerated individuals here created sophisticated murals. They participated in photography programs to document their own lives, and many artworks were created using any and all found materials that residents could get their hands on.
Hmm.
For over a decade in the 50s and 60s, the site hosted a renowned jazz festival. Later in the 70s, the Inner Voices Theater Troupe was born here. And we take great pride in the fact that Chuck Brown, the godfather of go-go, fostered his musical talent and learned guitar while incarcerated here.
Oh,
And
wow.
yeah, and he often would talk about how Lorton played a tremendous influence in his early life. So we don't believe that we're forcing art into a prison. We're really reclaiming and reinforcing a creative history that was already there by centering our mission on art and community. We're able to honor the creative spirit that managed to survive within these walls for decades by highlighting this legacy and continuing to foster the creative spirit.
Oh, absolutely. And that's such a wonderful thing to be able to continue doing. Um, Now, this site has really undergone an incredible evolution from a place designed for confinement to one dedicated towards creative freedom. How does that history as a prison inform or even challenge the work you do as an art center?
Mm. Yeah, this history informs the decisions we make because we are constantly balancing two opposing identities, the one of confinement with the other of creative freedom. This presents us with unique challenges and opportunities. We, of course, have the challenge of the space. Our greatest hurdle is also our greatest asset, our historic buildings. And
Mm,
coming from a historic building, I'm sure you understand as well.
yes.
While constructed for a very different purpose 100 years ago, we conduct most of our business in structures meant to be prison dormitories. We're fortunate in that the original prison was meant to afford inmates more access to the outdoors than what you might think a stereotypical prison would.
Mm.
The dormitory style quarters of most of our buildings and large central quad allow us to create an inviting educational space. We're able to ensure the site feels welcoming and vibrant without erasing its past. We also believe in art as a human right. We believe that self-expression is fundamental. In a place that once was defined by the removal of rights, we now center our mission on the freedom to create. This is where we find most common ground with you guys, our neighbors, Gunston Hall. Just as George Mason championed inherent rights, we champion the right to expression. And we also really believe in the healing power of the arts. We don't shy away from the fact that the prison's latter years were marked with extreme violence and trauma. That history changes us to be more than just a gallery. It tasks us with being a place of reclamation. By bringing over 70 artists onto this campus, we are engaging daily in the act of creation and healing through art. Ultimately, that we're providing a site that once was dedicated to isolation and the othering of the individual, and successfully transforming it into a hub for the community, for connection, and for healing.
That is truly a difficult task, but a very important one.
Yeah.
Now, segueing into our discussion on George Mason in particular, in his Virginia Declaration of Rights, George Mason's work speaks to the rights of citizens who have been arrested or charged with a crime. However, his writings don't explicitly state any additional rights for those who have been incarcerated. Can you talk a little bit about how the rights of the incarcerated at the workhouse have changed over time?
Sure. Um, I think this is a real connection to George Mason's legacy. While Mason focused heavily on the rights of the accused, due process, prevention of cruel and unusual punishment, the actual daily rights of the convicted remain a very gray area for centuries. At the workhouse, we see two very different chapters of how those rights were claimed or stripped away. Um, First, with the suffragists, the real first high-profile people to be incarcerated at the workhouse. The suffragists were imprisoned here in 1917, including Lucy Burns, who is the largest figure on this slide here. And they were instrumental in redefining the rights of prisoners. These women argued that they were political prisoners, not criminals, and demanded rights associated with that status. And when their rights to dignity and fair treatment were denied, they engaged in hunger strikes. The subsequent state-sanctioned force feedings and a night of terror where they were met with brutal violence was really a turning point in that political fight. And their treatment eventually led to a landmark court ruling that their incarceration was illegal, highlighting that the government cannot use imprisonment to suppress the right of free speech. But in addition to the suffragists, the average inmate throughout Lorton's 91-year history, the concepts of rights evolved from a real rehabilitative ideal to a much harsher reality. Originally, the workhouse, with its progressive era beginnings, was designed as a prison without walls. The right to fresh air, meaningful labor on a farm, and the lack of traditional cells was intended to be a more humane, progressive form of correction. As the decades passed, particularly in the 60s and 70s, overcrowding, aging infrastructure led to breakdown of those rights. We moved from a site of reform to one of confinement. Over time, the struggles for rights shifted forward: the right to maintain human identity, the right to education, the right to legal counsel, and as I mentioned earlier, the right to creative expression through music and art programs. There were many court cases over the course of the prison's history where inmates sue the Department of Corrections for what they believe to be infringements of their rights. I've seen a number of cases pertaining to segregation during the civil rights era, freedom of religion when conversion to Islam was starting to become popular in the 70s, and cruel and unusual punishment in the 80s and 90s when the prison population was far exceeding capacity. Today, we use the museum to tell these stories because it's important to remember that the rights are not static. They're something that must be constantly defined and defended, whether in 1776, 1917, or today.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a fantastic point. Now, so we've talked a little bit about how these rights have changed over time, but I am sort of wondering how your museum's interpretation of this incarceration has changed over time.
That's a great question, and it certainly has. Our interpretive journey has been one of expanding the lens. We certainly owe a debt of gratitude to the volunteer community members who first championed this history. As early as 2006, when our historic brick buildings were nominated for the National Register of Historic Places, the community understood these walls really did have stories to tell. The evolution of our interpretation has happened in roughly 3 phases. First, we have a discovery phase, the early years of the workhouse. These early efforts were focused on uncovering. Our volunteers worked tirelessly to gather records and preserve the physical site. The building we inhabit today, a former 1980s era cell block, was always earmarked to hold a museum because of its raw, preserved state. The next milestone, which happened close to this building's opening in 2020 with the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, the primary focus there was towards the suffrage movement. We dedicated significant resources to the Lucy Burns Gallery to honor the women who suffered here for the right to vote. This put the workhouse on the map as a site of national civil rights significance. But now we've pivoted to a more human-centric interpretive focus. In the more recent years, and particularly during my tenure, we have intentionally turned to a better understanding of what it was like to live and work at Lorton. We're working on uncovering the full 91-year history of the prison by focusing on the lived experience of everyone who was here, both those who worked here and those who were incarcerated, acknowledging the trauma and experience across the board. We've shifted from telling a story of institutions to telling that story through the individuals. We want to illuminate the humanity of those who are incarcerated here. Because art is such a deeply human expression, this shift has actually made our tie to the Arts Center even stronger. Whether we're discussing a suffragist in 1917 or a person incarcerated in the 1990s, we're looking at their creative output, their resilience, their experiences as proof of their humanity. And by interpreting the site this way, we ensure that the workhouse isn't just a look back at a closed prison, it's a living dialogue about human dignity.
And that is so important, um, for us to really think about. That is truly, I think that you all are going in such a fascinating direction, and I hope to see more as time goes on. Now, we have talked a little bit about one of the more popular groups that were incarcerated at the Workhouse Arts Center, the suffragists. With the nearby memorial to these women, this history of the workhouse is gaining a lot of attention. But do you share any lesser known histories at the workhouse? And if so, how are you seeking to make these histories more wider known?
Sure. I do have some lesser known suffrage facts that I can share, or more lessons and corrections that we tend to make with people when they come through the door. Um,
Fantastic.
yeah. Our first fun fact regarding how we interpret our history, many people come to our museum asking to see the suffragette exhibit, but we don't actually have one. The term suffragette was actually a diminutive term used by the press to belittle women both in the US and England during the suffrage movements happening at the same time in both countries. While the British activists eventually owned the term and actually turned quite militant to show exactly what a little suffragist could do, the American women never embraced it. As suffragists, they rejected the suffix because they saw themselves as an absolute equal to men who deserved the same rights. So we make it a point to let our visitors know we don't have a suffragette exhibit, we have a suffragist exhibit. We also find ourselves correcting pop culture narratives found in movies like Iron-Jawed Angels or the hit musical Suffs on Broadway. For instance, many folks assume Alice Paul was imprisoned here at the Occoquan Workhouse. She actually wasn't. The administration intentionally kept her separate from her National Women's Party co-leader, Lucy Burns. They wanted to prevent them from organizing while incarcerated. Lucy was the one who was imprisoned at our site, and she was actually incarcerated more than any other woman in the American suffrage movement.
Oh,
And
wow.
she bore the brunt of the struggle here on site,
Mm.
which is one of the reasons why she became our namesake for the gallery. And then additionally, we really are working to make the darker hidden history of our site wider known. We moved past kind of the sanitized textbook version and try to touch on the reality of torture. These women were subjected to brutal force feedings and
Mm.
physical abuse during the Night of Terror. And the monument down in Occoquan Regional Park, adjacent to our site, is Turning Point Suffrage Memorial, named as such because the specific treatment of the women during the Night of Terror became public knowledge, and that was seen as a real turning point for the suffrage movement. So through our interpretation in gallery and in our programming, we really try to kind of set those real world facts straight.
Absolutely. And you honestly just shifted my perspective as well. These were a lot of things that I feel like are just so common in pop culture references that
Mhm.
it's sort of difficult to stop mythologizing them.
Absolutely. Yeah.
um, I do have a question for you about your human-centric focus. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about some of the challenges that you all have faced in transitioning to this more human-centric focus, to trying to turn the lens on the individuals. and their stories as opposed to sort of the more broad history.
Yeah, I mean, becoming more human-centric did require a very intentional pivot on our behalf. And I think, you know, our galleries show what was available to be collected. A lot of information came from former corrections officers who,
Mm.
had worked in the area, were still in the area, and were really invested in telling the history of the place where they worked.
Yeah,
Many of the people who are incarcerated here, though, I mean, if they were here when the prison closed, they were transferred to other institutions. And so I think the way that we're approaching the history now is maybe not something that could have been done when they were first gathering the history.
for sure.
Um, Absolutely. And so much of this happens through luck, to be honest. A lot of returned citizens or justice impacted individuals who were incarcerated at Lorton will come back because they hear the prison is gone and this is what it's been changed into. And
That's
so,
wonderful.
yeah, we like to let folks know that we are appreciative of them sharing their stories with us. We are
Absolutely.
more than happy to be part of a healing journey
Yeah,
if that's something that they want and they're comfortable with. So when those folks do engage with us, it's very much on a case by case basis. We let them know, we have a oral history program where we try to collect stories officially,
oh,
but we're also
wonderful.
happy to just take time to walk through our galleries and talk with folks. It's really, I mean, not only are we sharing the human experience, but the collection of these experiences is also very human. It's a person to person relationship that really
For
needs to be
sure.
done.
No,
Yeah.
100%. And I am so happy to hear that this is the track that you guys are on. I guess I was also sort of wondering what inspired this sort of shift in perspective at the museum space.
Sure. I think, when I came on board, as you mentioned in my introduction, I have a lot of experiences with museums and cultural institutions, but my experience is not as a scholar on incarceration or the suffrage movement. The context of our site is something that I learned coming on board, and really
Hmm,
like by immersing myself in this information. Um, I definitely came from more of a museum perspective. And coming here and just learning the information and reading through things, I noticed some holes. And I was like, I feel like our interpretation needs to almost be like a pyramid, where we're looking at news articles and media from the time frame to see, what was going out to the public. And in many
absolutely.
senses, that information would be conveyed straight from the administration. So we have the media and administration on one side of things. And
Mm,
then on the other side of things, we have the corrections officers, the people who worked here. And while that side, not as strong as the media, was still pretty strong. And what we were lacking on that base was the inmate experience. And there were a
for sure.
handful of former inmates that we had information from. For example, Chuck Brown gave, our early volunteers an oral history and talked to us.
Yeah,
Um, but obviously his experience leaving Lorton, becoming a famous musician, like that's not going to be the everyman's experience.
for
So
sure. Yes.
yeah, and the suffragists, they talked to the public quite a bit and wrote memoirs, and so we knew their experiences. But what about your average guy who was, spent 10 years in here in the 80s? Where were those experiences? And so
For
as I
sure.
slowly started making connections into that community, I realized by adding kind of that third layer to create this pyramid or triangle, it created a really solid foundation for what we were telling here. So that's kind of how we started down this path, was just noticing what was missing and
That
what
makes
could make this
sense.
a richer historical and impactful experience.
Absolutely, absolutely. Those um, almost hidden voices are just as important as the rest of the story.
Absolutely.
Um, I do have another question for you. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about some of these artists who spent time at the workhouse and if you
Sure.
have any information on them at all. What do you all know about these people?
Well, sadly to say, we don't have a lot of strong information on individual artists, especially visual artists on
For
campus.
sure.
The one thing that's super clear is that art was everywhere. I know when I showed some images, I showed a few pieces along the way.
Yeah.
One image was a black and white image of a man kind of selling his art. Like sometimes the artists on campus would have almost like yard sales of art
Wow.
that they would offer up to people who were allowed to come on to campus.
Yeah.
We've got a couple unrehabilitated buildings on campus that when you go into them, there's murals all over the walls. One day I was stepped into one and it was like an enclosed office space that had no window, but somebody had painted a window
Oh my
in
God.
the area. So it looked like you were looking out onto like a really like just pastoral landscape.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh,
which was
that's
really
powerful.
cool.
Wow.
Yeah. There are some really just amazing things like that around.
Sure.
One artist I know of for certain, there it was a gentleman by the name of Herbert Hall, who actually was he was on death row before
Mm,
DC got rid of the death penalty.
okay.
And his sentence was swapped over to life imprisonment when the death penalty when DC decided to rid themselves of it. And he and another inmate worked together to create a crucifix for the chapel on campus.
Wow.
Um, and we have it in our gallery. It is humongous. I think it's right over there. You can't see it, but it's about, I would say, 8 feet tall.
Oh my.
And the actual figure of Christ, they call him Christ the prisoner, and they modeled it after Mr. Hall. He was, I believe they actually cast his body as like to be the sculpture because he was the ultimate prisoner, right? Like he was on death row and then he transitioned to um you know a life sentence.
Yes.
And so
Yes.
we do have a few pieces like that where we have names attached to the items, but a lot of times, many of these things have been lost in history. We
Mm,
have a few pieces that have been donated to us. Maybe someone gave a corrections officer or a warden or administrator a piece of art to thank them for something. And so then the family takes the piece and they have it, and eventually they're like, oh, Grandpa got this when he worked out at Lorton. Let's give it to the museum so they have it. So we don't we
makes
don't
sense.
always have a lot of that's been lost, unfortunately. But we
For
do
sure.
try to, honor the legacy by keeping the artwork as in best of condition as we can, show it to
Absolutely.
others so folks can see the creativity and the talent that was here.
Yeah. Oh,
Yeah.
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
And how many oral histories have you collected thus far from former inmates?
Ooh, not as many as I would like, to be honest. The oral history process can take a really long time from kind of the initial conversations, especially with someone who was incarcerated here. We always want to tread very lightly. We understand that incarceration can be an extremely traumatic experience. Some people
Yes.
do not want to relive that, and other people feel it's cathartic. Um, we just recently were working with Old Dominion University, and they helped us produce 3 oral histories this past fall. And so they
Ooh,
had their
yeah.
intro to documentary filmmaking students come up and do a visual filming. And so we're in the process right
That's
now of
wonderful.
transcribing those and getting all the permissions set so that we can have them live on our website.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
and then prior to that, those volunteers that were putting the museum together, they also collected oral histories. So we have this older archive we recently just digitized. So we're working on transcriptions for those as well. So those can go up on our website. And I believe we have about a dozen, but it's a mix of people. So some were administrators, some were inmates, some were corrections officers. I think we even have one oral history from a woman who was essentially a lunch lady here. Like she worked in the cafeteria, which is such an interesting perspective to see.
Is yes. Oh my goodness. All righty. So it looks like we are out of time, but thank you so very much, Katie, for speaking with us today. And thank you so much to our audience for joining us for our Rights of the Incarcerated mini-series. It is through your viewership, your financial support, and your attendance at Gunston Hall that allows for programs like these to continue. Please join us next month for the introduction to our Freedom series, where we will spend the next couple of months unpacking the freedom of the press and freedom of religion, the two freedoms that were included in George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights. Dr. Sam Lebovic from George Mason University will start us off with a discussion on freedom of the press on Wednesday, March 18th. We hope to see you then, and as always, stay hungry.
You're good. We're off.
Okay.